Please welcome our panelists. The first one is Dr. David Gallipo, who is the Global Chief of the United Nations Social Impact Fund. Second panelist is Liam Salter, who is the founder and CEO of Reset Carbon. And our moderator is our very own Chief of Operation, Alex Mavro.
I don't know how many of you had seen that before. Anybody? Yeah, a couple. I had as well, but it's amazing how things, sort of wow. Didn't realize that. I hadn't put that together from before. The whole theme is something that resonates with me particularly because as a very young child, which is before many of you are here, I watched some of the proceedings against tobacco on the old round black and white TV sets that they had, and they, as I say, barely knew what was going on, but there were all these stern faces saying, "Yeah, it's nothing to it. It's practically healthy for you." And then, as I commented to somebody up there during the film, many of you will probably realize that maybe within the last year, when I think the last time Beijing had its really bad weather and bad inversions, I think it was effectively the mayor of the town told people to go out and breathe deeply. Breathe it in, breathe it in. That's all you got to do. And many people did, and many people died. So it goes on. The disinformation campaign goes on. So we didn't decide on an order of commenting, but we'd like to hear from both our guests, and then open up the firing lanes for anybody who has questions or comments. So I'll just ask Liam, being closest to me, sorry about that, if you don't mind, Dr. David, to begin with some of your preliminary thoughts on it.
Well, hello. Give you a bit of my background. I've been working on climate change for about 20 years. Spent about 10 years in the NGO movement, so I know a couple of the guys in that movie. And at that point, and a fair amount of that, maybe 5 or 6 years working in the West, and another 5 years working in Asia, and then 10 years in the private sector in Asia. And so now our business is essentially corporate solutions, climate, and other sort of footprint issues. We're a commercial operation, essentially doing business for business, where business sees a business case for reducing its carbon. And I think that some comments. I mean, it's a shame we didn't look more at tobacco. Actually, I'm kind of interested. When we were looking at climate politics at WWF, sort of 2000s, we often looked at the tobacco stuff for the parallels, and we use that in our communications as to why people should be careful about what they're reading. I found it interesting that some of the same people pop up, but I think the key for me was there's a couple of things. First, when you get somebody who really goes through the data properly, it's really hard to say that the climate science is problematic. So when anybody takes time to do a proper review, like the guy who was the Skeptic magazine, or like Inglis, the congressman, it's very hard to deny that. So most of what we're dealing with is not really about, it's not really about the science. It really is the willingness to believe issue. I think the problem that we've got with climate now is that it's turned into a politically partisan issue in the States, where the guy said, I'm a conservative, I can't believe in climate change. I mean, that's actually now, you're not allowed to. And the
Exactly what he said, isn't it? What the radio announcer said.
well, then there was the grass tops group that goes and has essentially pushing Republicans to not support climate change, and I'm not sure who funds them. So I wonder if the interesting thing there is, if you go to, this is very American, if you go to other cultures, you don't see that. So you go to Europe, the sort of the left-right split and differing attitudes to climate change, you don't really see that. You might see the left being a bit more pushy in terms of more aggressive regulation. You might see the right favouring different types of economic instrument, but you don't see this disbelief. And when you come to Asia, you see almost nothing in terms of climate skepticism. And so you might see governments slow to respond because they've got other priorities, but you don't see climate science denial. There was an interesting poll I saw that was quite a high correlation between climate science denial and English-speaking countries, actually. And the explanation in the article was that essentially climate denial is a function of a sort of a neoliberal perspective that you find more often in English-speaking countries. And then the other observation they made was that there's a correlation with the Murdoch press and Murdoch's own positions, and so that might also be a factor. But I think it's, Americans have got a bit of a cultural problem on climate change. Fortunately, I think the rest of the world is just kind of getting on with it. So, in a way, the movies, if you look at it from a global perspective or from the perspective of somebody outside America, it's all kind of interesting, and obviously it's important, but it's not the be-all and the end-all of the game. And I think we're sort of moving past the days where, a cultural problem in a limited number of countries is going to... It'll slow things down, and obviously time is important, but I don't think the problem in America looks like it's going to go on for some time. It's getting worse, right, since 2014 when this movie was made. It's getting more partisan, it's getting less discursive, so it looks like, that they might not come out of that loop for a while, whereas if you look at Chinese government policy, it's totally unambiguous as far as carbon emissions reductions are concerned. And they have aggressive carbon targets. So, the hope that I take from that is that's one country, that's one cultural sort of phenomenon, but maybe we're not going to have to deal with that everywhere.
Well, is that... there it is. Is such a large contributor. It's not just that they're not on board with the thinking behind it, the scientific thinking, but that they're such a large contributor to it. And I think they alluded to it quite well. Has anybody here read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything? Yeah. And it really, to me, that was a tremendous revelation, and she does, I think, a wonderful job of painting the picture very slowly until you sort of wake up and say, oops, there it is. But let's hear from Dr. David, please. Yeah.
Well, I'm not a climate specialist, but I'm probably a pretty good specialist in bullshit. A little bit about me. I work for tobacco. I come from the private sector. I work for the UN now. I come from the private sector, and I come from tobacco, pharmaceuticals, banks, probably the three major evils out there. And they do actually engage in a lot of disinformation. I could tell you a lot of great stories. But I think the bigger point here is what I like to say. The bigger point here is really around, the social engineering that's going on, the way, the film's clearly biased, but on a purpose, right? So it's leading an agenda, it's leading a dialogue, it's leading an agenda. And on the opposite side is doing the exact same thing. And I think one of the interesting comments during the film was when the lobbyist was talking about gridlock. That's what they want. They can't stop it. They can't deny the science, but they can sort of slow the process down. And when you look at social engineering, has everyone seen Manufacturing Consent? The movie that Chomsky came out with? No, this is actually even a more powerful film, because it does talk about social policy and social engineering. So how do you influence masses? How do you influence societies into thinking in certain ways? Because I think for the common man, whether it's smoking, whether it is the pharmaceutical industry, whether it's banking, these types of things, they honestly don't care. They care about their family, they care about having a job, they care about moving forward. But when we look at how they drive sort of the argument at the political level, clearly the science is pure. Clearly smoking contributes to cancer. But the way they can deny it and drive the arguments into the political realm, that's I think the point here that's really becoming quite interesting, and it's going to get worse, I think now, because Trump now is starting the climate deny again, and some of the things. So when you look, I think one of the bigger things that's coming out is really who is sort of driving these agendas, and who actually has the power to drive the agendas. And clearly, it's industry. I think governments are having a bit of an identity crisis now, and I think what we see now with Trump being elected in, which I think is a good idea, not that Trump's elected, but it will sort of shake the Americans up a bit. But now that Trump has been elected, it is quite clear to the world, a lot of the politicians, and I see this from the UN side, that it really doesn't matter who the president of the UN, of the United States is, because they don't actually make many decisions. It's industry that's making the decisions. And it's clearly a model that the Chinese have perfected. Industry does make, because industry and government are very well connected in China, but they've done a very successful job in a lot of respects. So it really is now on who is driving that agenda, whether it is climate change, whether it is anything around pharmaceuticals, vaccines now is starting to pick back up. Certainly tobacco and anything related to addictive substance. So whether it's alcohol or now marijuana, these different things coming in. Who's driving that agenda? And the engineering behind that, where the masses are simply following into that herd and groupthink, following in based on these biases and labels, whether you're a conservative or a liberal, these different types of things, I think is a fascinating world that we're moving into right now. So that's the point that I'd like to bring up, and that's what I sort of get out of this, the dialogue out there.
Liam makes an interesting point, though, that particular linkage only exists really in the United States. That conservative feeling that way and liberals feeling, like the radio announcer practically called Inglis a traitor to his cause for being a conservative, very successful one. What do you say, 93 points on a, I mean, that's pretty well up there.
But it's not by accident. It's by design.
Well,
The American society is developed by design. It's not an accident that it is what it is right now.
yeah, I don't know. I know you're getting into the global world thing, government thing, but that's not. It's not.
Just briefly again, if you look at Edward Bernays, who started the School of Public Relations in the U.S., he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and used a lot of Freudian theory and bring that out. And it's all public. You can Google this. He actually started. His first client was a tobacco company, and the first job was to get women to smoke, because back in the day, men smoked, but women didn't smoke, and the tobacco companies wanted to sort of up their market, and so they hired Edward Bernays, the Bernays Company, to figure out how to design social policy that would allow freedom and the woman to smoke. And he was very successful in that. And he started the School of Public Relations in the U.S. And since then, the whole public relations industry has been hired by the governments and everything else to do social policy. And that's not a conspiracy theory. That's a lot of evidence behind that. And so again, a lot of this stuff is done by design. Oh, no. So the question here is, who wins in this whole argument? And it's industry. And the question is now, how do you stop industry? Because I don't think it's a political discussion. I think it's an economic discussion.
But it's been put into.
Yeah, it hides behind politics.
I don't think it is. I think it's if you look at industry's yeah, right. I mean, if you look at industry's perspectives on climate change, most sectors are now basically shifting towards how can we position ourselves to deal with this reality. most sectors whose business models force them to look beyond the short term are essentially saying, well, you have to make a choice. Are we going to take this seriously or not? And our long-term business strategies have to. You can't. There's no middle ground doing this. And so you do see, finance getting out of carbon. You see utilities getting out of carbon. You see companies committing to very ambitious carbon targets, like 50% reductions in 30 years, this kind of stuff that you can't just do incrementally, and you can't sort of PR your way around it. You're going to have to do things quite differently. Your business model will have to change. You've got some time. Nobody's doing it in three to 5 years. So I don't feel we have a lot of resistance, except in, there are parts of the private sector still left, the coal industry, stuff like that. But those guys, in terms of their economic significance and the political leverage that they have, are declining. I think you've actually seen climate change has now become, it's a big enough issue that it matters politically, and you can win or lose voters depending upon how you position yourself on it. There was so I was actually looking at all the British, some are Brit, you may have gathered, and UK's got its own problems right now, and one of the interesting things I was listening to recently is, in the UK we've got an independence party called UKIP, which is more or less the Tea Party-ish kind of thing, and drove a lot of the Brexit stuff. And now the way that they're positioning themselves politically is to win the vote of the left behind group. In other words, the people that are sort of politically been disenfranchised over the last 20 years. And the way that they portray climate change is it's a coffee table issue. So we won't even bother with this coffee table stuff. Real men and women need to talk about jobs and immigrants and stuff like this, and this climate change stuff's essentially bullshit. And so you see them importing a perspective on climate change into their political doctrine that's got nothing to do with climate change at all, and more about how can I use this issue to strengthen my political message to my target constituency. So it's total political opportunism in that sense. But climate is big enough to be useful in that context. And so I think it may have been an economic issue, but now it's starting to become something that is a matter of who it is. It's tribal. That was an interesting word that came out of that discussion. It is starting to become, I'm a liberal tribe, I believe in this, and I believe in all these other things that liberals believe in, and I'm not. I'm somebody else, and I have my own view on that. And what's interesting is whether or not we'll get those political perspectives and that tribalism replicated in other countries in the future. That could be kind of damaging, right? So if you did get UKIP winning a UK government election and consigning climate change to a coffee table issue, if you did see other right-wing movements in Europe picking that up and making it a kind of common policy issue across of Europe, and then you get the Australians, and what's interesting to me is I'm not sure a lot of the Asian governments would go for that, because they don't have this kind of dynamic in their political systems. The logic that a lot of Asian governments have come to on climate change is still economic, actually. And so I think the lens is different. So a lot of this might actually be a sort of quasi-Western phenomenon rather than something that we'll see much of here.
Well, I think I agree with you. In terms of responsiveness and one man, one vote, and all that. But China is turned around in many ways, and they are giving people, by and large, what they want, whether or not they have one man, one vote or not. So people can't breathe in Beijing. They're actually taking great steps to try to help them breathe in Beijing. So they can't vote one way or another, effectively. But so what? They may be able to breathe someday. But let's open it up. Let's hear from our, oh, we got all kinds of hands going up here. Let me see. Okay, I don't know which order. Let's start. I'll just go left or right, if you don't mind. That's just fast, left, turn phrase here. Okay.
Hi, my name is Kenneth Knight. I'm a recent graduate here from Sasson and from the United States, not only from the United States, but from southwestern Pennsylvania, which is the heart of the coal and steel industry in the United States up until probably like the mid 1980s. And I think what Mr. Salter said about some of these companies, like the carbon companies, oil, coal, and then automotive industry, not having as much power, may be true in like in the total economic GDP they provide, but as far as their constituents, that's where the real power comes from in the United States now, anyway, especially looking at this last election. I can speak from my experience from Denora, Pennsylvania. 1958, they had I think it was 58, they had the Denora smog, which killed about maybe a dozen people in Denora because of a temperature inversion and all the smoke from the steel mills. At that point, that's when I think the worker who had a job realized, well, the industry that's paying our bills and putting the roof over our head is actually killing us as well. So we're okay with the setup of the EPA and the Clean Air Act. But after those industries moved, you had the left behinds who are now out of a job and their houses are crumbling, but they can't reinvent themselves for a new type of industry. And that's where I think the power for the coal and the steel and automotive industry is really kind of digging into those left behinds. And that's, if you lay the electoral map over and look at the blue and the red, it's all in the Rust Belts states and the areas where people really need something and they need to change in order to be able to catch up with the new 21st century's economies, and they can't.
Yeah, I think that's pretty self-evident. But the question is, well, why do you turn one way or the other for solution? You know, I think that, to me, that's
I would think that the industries are kind of grabbing onto whatever they have, and they have people that are unhappy with.
so that industry
Yeah.
okay. I got you now. I got you. I'm sorry, misunderstood. Let's continue on here, Ito.
Yeah. I'd like to relate to this political versus corporates issue. And my bottom line is politics is key. And, denials of issues we're always here: smoking, Holocaust, equality, racism, respect for animals, or do good, basically. We're always here. And the good news that the smoking industry is going down, that's good news, right? It was brought in the film in order to show that there is a hope for the climate change as well, because it's going in a good direction. But we have now the politics which are really keeping it on hold. We have Trump, we have Netanyahu, Putin, or Erdogan, same thing. They're playing on the on hatred of the people. And in what they're doing, in a sense, they're kind of attacking the educated, the liberals. And the educated and liberals and scientists are supporting, global warming, which is, for us, it's obvious. So that's what they're doing. Anything which is like rational, good, etc., is being attacked by them. And they're doing. The first thing that Trump did in the very first day in his office, he just, took off the climate change parameter, whatever that was, from the website. So that's key. What can we do about it? We can't fight Trump because this is his fuel. Hatred and antagonism is his fuel. So my answer is education. People. That movie is about PR, about convincing people, educating people. So the more people are educated and less ignorant they are, the more they're exposed to have their own independent opinion and oppose the bad leaders which we are exposed to today.
Education is the answer.
Yes.
Okay. Before we'll ask for comments from our panel, but education is not the answer. there's not enough education out there? Try to use your mic because we're trying to.
I think facts don't matter a whole lot. I think people believe what they have beliefs and values, and then they stack facts on top that fit the beliefs and values. So the question I wanted to ask is, what do you do? How do you win people over when when facts don't work?
Maybe just okay. But I'm sorry. Back first, and then. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that actually in the history of science, the scientists have always lost. I mean, you go back to the Vatican versus Galileo. Who won? It took so long, right? That's a very good point. Education is not the key, and as Ido said, politics always wins. It's somebody in the film said it's about being a good member of the tribe, and that if you come up with something that threatens the tribe, which is what the climate scientists have done, then you're screwed basically. It's only when you can come up with an alternative. I'm not going to say alternative fact, an alternative reality, an alternative scenario that is more promising. Right, when you look at people like Elon Musk, Tesla, that they're actually showing something that's even more promising than what the coal industry and the petrochemical industry are putting out. That's when you start to see people buying into the new ideas. But that's just my opinion.
So you're saying we need an alternative argument? Okay.
Yeah, my question.
One more, and then we'll have the panel.
Okay, my question. I have two, and I have both of them are for Mr. Salter. You brought it up that it's more of it's like you said, economy and politics versus politics. So the thing is, first, I mean, from your experience, when you go out to pitch for a project, the projects are like it's how many of them, what percentage of it you get on pure environmental ROI, and how much of that is from economic ROI. And yeah, and then in Asia it's more like, because we call them emerging economies, or there's a lot of industrialization, so that would definitely have environmental impact. So how do you see that? I mean, the industrialization in Asia or the emerging economies versus the policy on government reaction to the environment. Thank you.
Did you catch two? Okay. Okay, good. Thank you very much. Then we'll go reverse order. We'll start with Dr. David.
Now, thanks for the questions. They're interesting comments. I want to go back to the politics versus economics for a minute. And I think the premise, when you look at the way that the movie was set up, a magician was talking about, diversion, distraction. And I would look at that. I think the politics are the distraction. The politics is the theater. That's what everyone's looking at. And, the Koch brothers and everyone behind what's being driven. Who pays for the politicians nowadays? I mean, who's buying the politicians? So the politicians are mouthpieces. They're saying things. And they're not meaning what they're saying. They're just simply saying things because they're being advised and briefed into certain directions. And I've seen this also in other countries as well. So that's the diversion. Everyone's looking at the politics. Everyone's worried about Trump. What's really happening again is the economics. They're trying to bleed as much out of the current industry as they can. So if it's coal and oil and everything else, we see it with the so-called, this Murphy's Law of technology, which is just made up. It's just a way to bleed more money out of the chips to slow down innovation, because you want to take more profitability out of the innovations that you have. You don't want to bring in too much innovation too quickly. You lose that length of profitability on your initial investment. So, and I do look at it from an investor side, because that's what I do now. I invest for the UN. And we look for investment projects. So I work with capital market investors, government investors, this type of stuff. And we look at SDG projects. So, we sort of SDG aligned. They're impact projects, if you will, or projects that work with development and public goods, but also create a fair amount of profitability. And that's what seems to drive things, I think, when it comes down to. It's the economics of the issue that are coming down. So I'll touch on that. education is interesting. I think education is important in that that's where you're going to get the common man to have that dialogue, this coffee table discussion. And I think that's going to be a force because in the end, the common man, whether they vote or not, is truly not that important. Whether they buy is extremely important. So your common man is the consumer. And if the consumer wants to go for energy coming from electricity as opposed to energy coming from gas and oil to support, that's going to drive industries. That's going to disrupt industry. The consumers are sort of the base point of disrupting industries. And that's what most corporations are afraid of. Because the consumer is their enemy in that sense. They play good, they want them to buy stuff and everything else. But the way that marketing works is by making you feel unhappy. A happy consumer doesn't buy anything. An unhappy consumer buys a lot. And that's the whole drive when you look at what advertising and everything else. Advertising's not your friend. It's to make you insecure. So you buy things. It's to compare things. And that's the way that things work. Governments, I don't think they're that, and I work for the UN, and I don't think that terribly important. I don't know a really good government, quite honestly. Maybe the Swiss. But I come from Canada, and I wouldn't even trust the Canadian government. Because they say things on one side around climate change and everything else. But if you look at the reality of Canada, the warmer it gets in Canada, and this is straight for Russia and all the northern countries, the warmer it gets, the more arable land we have, the more agricultural land we have, the more oil we get out of the tar sands. We become richer as the world gets warmer. And that's the truth in Canada. That's the economic truth. And I'm not a climate denier, by the way. But this is sort of the economic truth. And I see that from investors. And if you look at the amount of money going into climate change from the development side to the amount of money not going into climate change from the capital market side, it dwarfs by far the amount of money that's going into climate change. By far. In magnitudes of 10 and 15 and 20. I mean, huge amounts. And I think things do have to change, but I think the reality comes down to, going back to this education point, is that the better we can inform the common man, and the better that the man can make decisions based on economic value, and voting as well, but I think economic value is much more powerful these days. If you can convince the consumers to change, you'll convince corporations to change, and if you can do that, you'll convince governments to change. That's my rant.
All right. Liam?
Yeah, we covered quite a lot of ground. So I think that I pick up on the facts don't work point first. I mean, if facts don't work, we've got a serious problem, and all kinds of shit is going to happen. It's going to be very bad. So I mean, I think that we might be, I think we might be at the beginning of a cycle whereby we go through a phase where facts matter less until so much fallout results from that they start to matter again. I hope. I mean, let's face it, a lot of the arguments that are being used to generate political support won't actually solve the problems of the constituencies that are coming on board to support these political movements. So, immigration's a red herring, climate change is a red herring. A lot of, this is not why Rust Belts are poor. So you might be able to fool people for a bit, and sort of by being refreshingly populist and bombastic, that's kind of nice when nobody's been listening to you for a while, but as a long-term political strategy, it's probably not terribly effective. However, facts can go out the window for quite a long time in some cultures, as we've seen from history. And I think how that plays out is going to be quite important. That said, I don't, so climate change got out the box. It might have started off as a fossil fuel lobby taking tobacco industry tactics as a way to cause gridlock and kind of muck things up. But I think it's gone beyond that now. It's been hijacked by political movements and being turned into a cultural issue that has actually nothing to do with the economics anymore. So just, I pick up a little bit on your point. When we pitch, and these are, we're pitching purely private sector pitches, and so usually there's no, we don't have very many countries or customers where they are regulated on carbon yet, because we work in Asia. So we don't really get too many pictures where the company goes, I've got to do something, Liam, here, have some cash. It's more about, the value proposition. And it works best when we've got both. We've always got the economic one because everybody in Asia, actually everybody in the world, is kind of inefficient. So we can usually save most people some cash. And that varies sector by sector about whether that's an interesting amount of cash or not. That may not be enough to get us over the line. I think where you bring in the environmental argument is, it's less about, some of our customers are privately owned, and in Asia we do have privately owned large companies that are still privately owned, and where the chairman's view on something will make a difference to whether they go and do this or not, and those are often some of the strongest companies that we work for. And we've also got companies with customers who care about their environmental performance as well. So it's where we can bring those two together that we have very kind of high strike rate on our pitch, and where we're just pitching on the economics, it usually exists, but it may not be a big enough priority to get us higher. What we don't find very much is struggling to find a business case. We don't. There are too many concerned customers and too many high energy bills for us to struggle. So I feel like talking to some of our corporate customers about what they think about Trump, for example, it's a bit early for a lot of them, but there's nobody backing away yet. There's nobody kind of going, right, climate's out, this is the new dawn, and we better dial back on our carbon policies that we've been building for the last 10 years, linking to our brand for the last 10 years, communicating to our investors and our employees for the last 10 years. Whether they'll still feel that way after another 5 years of mayhem, who knows? But at the moment, they seem to be, they've built core economic logic that says we need to act on this because mankind isn't going to be deliberately stupid. Whether it is or not, their business strategy says that we're not, right? I mean, no companies appear to have humanity is going to flake out, and we better just prepare for that. I haven't heard anybody talking about that yet. And therefore, we're going to, our models that say carbon's going to get more expensive, governments are going to regulate. Customers are actually, people are pretty ambivalent about customers. You won't see too many companies saying, I believe my customers are going to care about climate change, I've got to evolve my products. I think that's overstated by companies when we actually look at what drives their core strategies. So, in a way, I think it may be, ironically, some economic rationalism in the business community that might even hold us through some of the partisan political stuff that we're going to see, because one of the problems the NGOs have is that they're earmarked in the political debate now. As WWF before, we used to be able to kind of reasonably appeal to people that we talk to as scientists. I think NGOs now are struggling to present that. They're getting automatically dropped into a political camp that you are, so they're getting thrown into political melee, whereas before they've had some ability to stay above it. So we may find that it's actually the economics that saves us in all of this, ironically. I mean, I think last year, or was it the year before, was the first year that total investment in renewables was greater than total investment in fossil. That's not small money, and that's not a small shift. And that's just the beginning. So if that's where we're locked into now, that's only one industry, I agree. But if you take that kind of trend on board, there's a lot of capital that is realigning with a low carbon future. It's going to take quite a lot of political damage for that to be pulled out. I think it's still going to keep going. People are going to look at China and say, that carbon target is going to be delivered. And I think that may influence their investment strategies a bit more than what's happening at the White House.
Yeah, very, very likely. I could see that. Okay, just a quick closing word then also from
Well, I just want to add to the point, because I think you're right. I think the economics that got us into this mess It's the same economics that are going to pull us out of this mess. Because, I mean, from the investment side, a lot of the interest I get from investors is in clean tech, green tech, renewable energies. I know the investment scout for BP, and they're buying up a lot of this new technology to exploit it. So there is, I think that the economics are going to actually pull us back out of this mess at some point. And it's starting to shift. I don't think it is that important. I think it now will become sort of an Asian discussion point at some point and move away from America, because I think most of the industrialization is happening out here. Probably most of the pollution too, but most of the industrialization is happening out here. But there's definitely a shift in investment into green and clean tech.
Excellent. Well, you know, it's nice to close on a positive note.
Well, let me just
Okay.
come to your point on industrialized. I think Asia's got huge opportunity right now because the infrastructure is going in. There's still a lot to build. The efficiency opportunities are huge compared to what we're seeing at the moment. Even if we go in and do retrofits, we get 30% efficiency gains and highly investable on balance sheet paybacks. What we can get with new build, which we actually don't do that much of because it gets into design and stuff like that, which we don't really have that skill set. You can get amazing sort of efficiency gains and cost savings and carbon reductions. So I think it's what's interesting is when you start to factor if you're a smart company and you're factoring the environmental thinking into your new build decisions, and you're saying this is capital stock that's going to be around for 30, 40 years. I'm probably going to be in a carbon priced world for 20, 30 years or that. I don't quite know what it's going to look like. I better just be smart about this and not leave myself with a stranded asset. You've got a big opportunity to improve the efficiency and the performance of your business. I think a lot of companies look at it in that way. They don't kind of go, oh God, carbon targets. They're more like, well, we've got to build all this stuff anyway, and actually a 50% cut across our company if we've got a load of new build rather than all existing stock is going to be relatively easy for us compared with maybe more established infrastructure driven companies. So I don't think it used to be that Asia said we need room to grow, right? Now I don't hear that politically so much. It's more or less, okay, climate's real, we're going to need to do something, it's all going to be, everybody's got to do equivalent level of responsibility, but in that context, there is a lot we can do in our economies that makes sense.
Okay,
Both
again,
from a carbon perspective.
that is a positive note, and that's what I'm saying. It's a good note to end on. I don't think
We
there's.
can take some more questions if people.
No. We're beat that. Thank you very much. He'll be around if everyone wants to continue to talk. He'll be around. Yeah, we're coming on at 8:30 now. We want to.
Oh,
This is our. Yeah.
your efficient lights
So,
will be turned off by your control system.
But I don't know how rational the arguments are one way or another. But there's another fascinating book recently came out called The Undoing Project. Anybody familiar with this? It's about two American, I guess they're dual nationals, American Israelis, who were sort of started off as in the philosophical realm, psychological realm, I guess, and then went into philosophy. And they were very different personalities, and they came together accidentally over a period of years, and they changed the landscape of thinking about how people come to decisions. And they would do this by asking such questions or giving a question to a person such as, there are 30% of this group is female, 70% is male. What percentage would be blonde? What percentage would be black-haired? And they were just trying to provoke them into coming up, and then they would change their thinking by preceding it with some statements of fact, or sometimes alternate fact, and then they would check the results on how they were influenced by it, and it's fascinating to see. I can't elucidate it properly, particularly in a short time, but it's fascinating to see how completely weird people's thinking can be, and when you look at the various arguments we've heard tonight, we're trying to, in many cases, we're trying to talk about facts, and that's good, but people just have different ways of adding all these facts up and coming to conclusions. So I think we got to factor that in as well with all these other good thoughts and with the the hopefully positive outlook that that some of us have coming out of this discussion tonight. So with that, please thank our panelists, and at least Liam and probably Dr. David will be around if you want to continue to this discussion. Okay, okay, great. And we'll see you again in a month or two with the next movie. Yep. Oh, okay. You should look at manufacturing consent. It's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. There you go.